Hey everyone. Tonight, we're gently drifting back to a time when kings trusted astrologers more than doctors, when monks passed secret notes more often than scripture, and when conspiracy theories didn't just live in the shadows, they occasionally sat in the throne room. So if you're ready to dim the lights, loosen your grip on reality just a little, and settle into history's quieter, stranger corners, get comfortable. And hey, if you enjoy these slow, sleepy dives into the absurd and the ancient, go ahead and hit the like button. Maybe even subscribe. Because clearly you've got excellent taste in late-night content. Oh, and if you've got a favorite conspiracy theory waiting in your mind like a medieval court jester in the dark, drop it in the comments. I do read them. Very slowly. With a lantern. Alright. Let's begin. Tonight we're looking at medieval conspiracy theories that everyone swore were nonsense. Ridiculous. Impossible. And then, centuries later, historians quietly went, "Ah. So they were right." It turns out the Middle Ages weren't just about kings in shiny helmets and peasants eating questionable soup. They were full of whispered suspicions that actually had teeth. Let's start our drift through this candlelit chaos with a king who was right to be paranoid. The king who thought his wife was plotting against him. And she was. Meet Henry VI of England. A king more famous for being tragic than being kingly. Soft-spoken. Gentle. Deeply religious. Exactly the kind of personality you do not want on the throne during the 100-Year War. Henry was married to Margaret of Anjou, a French noblewoman with the political instincts of a shark. Good for her. Bad for Henry. People whispered, quietly, that Margaret was the real ruler. That she was plotting behind the scenes. That she wanted Henry gone. Replaced. Maybe quietly stuffed in a tower. Medieval rumors said she had a lover. That she was having the heir of England secretly raised in her likeness. People in the 15th century might have been dramatic, but in this case, they weren't wrong. Today, historians agree Margaret did run the government. She did push aside Henry's advisors. And she did everything short of officially gluing the crown to her own head. The conspiracy, the one Henry's enemies loved talking about, was basically true. Margaret was absolutely trying to seize control. Just very politely. Let's drift a little deeper. To a war that supposedly started over a stolen bucket. Spoiler, it really did. In the early 14th century, long before Italians were just arguing about football and pasta, the city-states of Medina and Bologna went to war. Why? Because someone stole a wooden bucket. The medieval rumor was that Bologna blamed Medina for breaking into their city and stealing the communal bucket from their town well. And they got so furious that they raised armies and fought a proper battle. Everyone assumed it was a joke. Something exaggerated over time. A medieval meme. Because who would start a war over a bucket? Well, Medina still has the bucket. In a museum. And the war really happened. It lasted 12 years. People died. Over wood. This isn't a conspiracy, really. It's just proof that the Middle Ages needed therapy. Or maybe just more buckets. Next, something darker. The Vatican. 1328. Rumor had it that the Church was installing fake popes and forging miracles to control the masses. Absolutely wild, right? Except. When Pope John XXII died, his secret ledgers were discovered. Inside were records of payments. Gifts. Bribes. Entire political deals. Traced like a medieval Excel sheet. The Church wasn't just preaching faith, they were editing reality. One of his most famous critics, Dante, directly accused the papacy of corruption, simony, and treason. And everyone rolled their eyes, until centuries later when historians basically said, actually, Dante wasn't just writing poetry, he was writing a police report. So yes. The conspiracy that the medieval church manipulated politics and wealth at the highest level. Confirmed. The only thing missing was a Netflix documentary. Finally, let's float into the strangest truth of all. The rumor that medieval knights used secret tattoos to identify each other in battle. Sounds like TikTok-level fanfiction. Except, excavated remains from English and German crusaders showed marks carved into bone. Symbols. Crosses etched where tattoos would have been. And chroniclers mentioned marks on the flesh, used for burial identification, because armor could be removed. Skin couldn't. A secret brotherhood symbol? Not exactly. But close enough that medieval knights might give you a knowing nod if you mentioned it. And just like that, another conspiracy slides from absurd to, well, now that you mention it. We'll stop here for tonight. Before your brain starts connecting dots that aren't there. But if you're still awake, and if you're not, well, mission accomplished. Tap that like button before your phone slips off the bed. Subscribe if you find yourself returning to these dimly lit historical nooks. And seriously, tell me in the comments, what medieval conspiracy should we quietly unravel next? Until then, let the torches go out. Let the stone halls empty. And let your mind drift. More soon.
Back to a time when central heating wasn't even a fever dream. And yet, somehow, people still insisted on building houses out of rock. Thick, cold, drafty, echoing stone. Because apparently, comfort was optional when you had feudal power and a moat. So dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket, maybe two. Because we're about to spend the night in a medieval castle. And trust me, you'll need them. We're talking about the surprisingly creative, sometimes downright questionable ways medieval people tried to stay warm through endless European winters. Let's drift back, not to the glorious battlefields or glittering banquets, but to the real, unglamorous question. How did anyone survive inside a medieval castle when it was basically a stone refrigerator with a draft problem? The castle, a freezer with flags now. First of all, a castle was never meant to be cozy. It was meant to be impressive. You didn't build one to say, "Welcome home, friends." You built it to say, "Try attacking me, and good luck not freezing while you do it." Stone walls, thick and tall, were perfect for defense, and terrible for warmth. They trapped cold, they radiated cold, and they held onto cold like your ex holds onto grudges. You could light a fire in every room, and by the time you'd gotten one side warm, the other side would already be frosting over again. And yes, castles looked amazing in summer. Banners flying, sunlight glinting off turrets. But the moment November hit, those same grand halls turned into wind tunnels. Imagine sitting down for dinner while your soup freezes in real time. So what did medieval people do about it? Did they invent early heating systems? Nope. Did they suffer quietly and invent passive-aggressive complaints centuries before the Victorians? Absolutely. But they also got creative. The Great Hall, center of cold and occasional fire. Let's start with the heart of any medieval castle, the Great Hall, the social, political, and dining hub. It was also the one place where you had any real shot at not losing a toe to frostbite. In the middle of the hall was the hearth, a giant open fire pit, not tucked away in a fireplace, but literally in the center of the room. You could throw on a few logs, gather your household around, and bask in what might generously be described as lukewarm survival. Smoke from this giant open fire didn't exactly go up a chimney, because chimneys, as it turns out, were kind of a luxury invention that came later. Instead, the smoke rose up into the rafters, swirled around for a while, stained everything black, and eventually maybe escaped through a hole in the roof, the so-called louver. If the wind was right, the smoke would go out. If it wasn't, congratulations. You just invented indoor camping. Eyes watering, lungs wheezing, everything smelling like burnt mutton and wet wool. But hey, it was warm. Kind of. Floors of straw, walls of tapestries. So, let's say you're a 13th century noble trying not to shiver to death while pretending to enjoy your venison stew. What else could you do? Well, start with the floor. Stone floors were basically medieval ice rinks, so people covered them with layers of rushes, dried plants, reeds, straw, anything vaguely insulating. They'd sprinkle sweet herbs in there too, like lavender or thyme, partly for the smell, and partly because floor hygiene wasn't a phrase that existed yet. It helped a little, but it also created a home for, bugs, mice, and the occasional medieval surprise. So every few months, someone would scrape up the old straw and spread down a new layer, as though that was a normal part of civilized life. And on the walls, you didn't hang art, you hung tapestries. Giant embroidered wall hangings weren't just decoration, they were insulation. Thick wool or silk panels helped block drafts, absorb echoes, and make those stone walls slightly less tomb-like. Of course, not everyone had fancy tapestries. The average castle servant just slept next to the wall and hoped their blanket didn't freeze to it overnight. Bedrooms, drafty luxury. Now, bedrooms in castles were, well, let's call them aspirational. You might think the lord and lady of the castle had it easy. Their own chamber, private fireplace, featherbed. But even the nicest medieval bedroom could feel like a crypt in January. Yes, some had fireplaces, but the smoke control was terrible. You could either have warmth or breathable air, not both. And when the fire burned out in the middle of the night, which it always did, the room cooled instantly. That's why medieval beds were so elaborate. Heavy wooden frames, thick mattresses stuffed with straw, furs, blankets, quilts, and the real MVP, bed curtains. Those weren't just decorative. They trapped your body heat inside a little pocket of warmth. It's basically the medieval equivalent of a sleeping bag fort. Servants, of course, had a slightly less glamorous setup. They'd sleep in the hallways, near the kitchen, or right by the hearth. Warmth over comfort. And if you were unlucky enough to be a guard stationed on the battlements, yeah, your shift came with free frostbite. Kitchens, the real hotspot. If you wanted actual heat, you went to the kitchen. Castle kitchens were full of fire. Ovens, hearths, spits, cauldrons, and probably smelled like a strange mix of roasting meat, burnt bread, and desperation. The cooks were the warmest people in the building, though probably also the most exhausted. That's why you'll often find that servants or guards like to just happen to wander near the kitchen when off duty. Not to sneak food. Okay, maybe a little. But mainly because it was the one place where you could actually feel your fingers again. Some larger castles even had a separate room called a warming chamber, where laundry was dried and guests thawed themselves before daring to go back out. It was the medieval equivalent of standing by a radiator for 30 minutes pretending to check your phone. Hot water, cold comfort. bathing in winter was optional, and for good reason. If you were rich, you might have a small bathing tub brought into your chamber. Servants would heat water in the kitchen and lug it up, bucket by bucket, while you tried not to think about how fast it was cooling. Bathing was a luxury, not a habit. And when you did it, you'd probably add herbs or petals. Again, partly for smell, partly because everyone believed certain plants warmed the humours. Poorer folk, they just hoped spring would come early. Clothing, layering like a medieval onion. Since architecture wasn't doing much for warmth, people turned to fashion. Medieval clothing was all about layering. Wool tunics, linen shirts, cloaks, fur-trimmed hoods, long stockings. Basically, they dressed like everyone was always 5 minutes away from a snowstorm. And no, they didn't all wear drab browns and greys. Wealthy people loved bright colours, deep reds, blues, greens, dyed with expensive pigments. It made them look important and slightly less like they were dying of hypothermia. The truly fancy had fur linings. Squirrel, marten, ermine if you were royal. Because nothing says I'm warm and superior like being wrapped in small woodland creatures. Let's float over to another winter trick. Body heat economics. When all else failed, there was always the simplest heat source: other people. Servants slept side by side in the hall. Families huddled together in bed. Even animals sometimes came indoors for warmth. There's historical evidence that livestock were kept in lower floors or adjoining rooms in smaller keeps. Not just for protection, but for heat. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And when the alternative is freezing alone, you get real comfortable with the smell of hay and goat breath. Castles in the north. The real ice palaces now. You might think this was just an English or French problem. But oh no. Go farther north, and the challenge got extreme. Scotland, Scandinavia, northern Germany. All full of castles that looked romantic but functioned like meat lockers. The Norse and Scots were at least somewhat used to the cold though. They layered furs, built smaller keeps with thicker walls, and used peat fires that burned long and hot. Even so, medieval chroniclers loved to complain about bitter winters, as if nature was personally out to get them. Which honestly, it kind of was. And that's where we'll leave things for tonight's stretch of Castle Survival 101. Open fires, smoky halls, straw-covered floors, and the noble art of pretending to be warm while slowly freezing to death. But don't worry. In part 2, we'll wander deeper into the cold stone corridors to explore how royalty coped differently from servants, how heating technology evolved, and why even kings sometimes slept in their clothes until April. So pull the blanket a little tighter. Let the fire crackle in your imagination. And remember, no matter how drafty your room feels tonight, at least you're not sleeping in a medieval tower with an open roof vent for ventilation. Part 2. Royal Warmth. How kings and queens survived the medieval winter. Soft wind hums through imaginary castle towers as the fire crackles, faintly in the background. Welcome back, my brave blanket-wrapped listener. You've made it through the drafty great hall, the smoky hearths, and the questionable straw carpets. And now, we're heading into the royal chambers themselves. Because if you thought servants had it bad, just wait until you realize how miserable it could be to be royalty in a stone fortress during a medieval winter. Sure, you had titles, gold, and the occasional fur-lined robe, but you were still sleeping in what was basically a refrigerator with curtains. Let's float gently from the kitchens and halls into the upper floors, where kings and queens tried, and mostly failed to make winter tolerable. The royal bedchamber, drafts, drapes, and desperation. The royal bedchamber might sound luxurious, and in paintings it certainly looks it. A grand canopied bed, carved wood, velvet drapes, and maybe a roaring fire in the corner. But the reality, still cold. So cold, in fact, that even the fire didn't help much. The walls radiated chill like a glacier. The windows leaked a wind like broken flutes. And the massive open spaces never trapped heat for long. Royalty fought back with layers. Not just of clothing, of everything. A good royal bed had a straw mattress, a feather topper, woolen sheets, fur blankets, and thick curtains that closed completely around the bed, forming what was basically a private tent. Inside it could be several degrees warmer than the rest of the room. A medieval miracle. Of course, it wasn't exactly romantic. The air got stale, the fire went out, and you'd wake up to see your breath fogging in front of your face. The kind of scene that makes you question whether absolute power was really worth it. When in doubt, sleep in your clothes. Let's be honest. The medieval approach to winter sleep was simple. Don't undress. Even royals, with all their silk and status, often just crawled into bed, wearing their undertunics, stockings, and sometimes even gloves. Because why risk hypothermia when fashion can wait till April? There are even accounts of nobles sleeping with small hoods on their heads, little cloth caps tied under the chin to keep the ears warm. Forget golden crowns. The real symbol of winter royalty was the nightcap. And no, they didn't change those sheets often, because laundry in a castle was a logistical nightmare involving boiling water, hauling, drying by firelight, and prayer. So people tended to rely on perfume, herbs, and denial. Chimneys, the medieval game changer. Now, at some point, humanity decided that maybe, just maybe, all the smoke in the living room was a problem. That's when the chimney entered the chat. Chimneys began appearing in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, first in monasteries and wealthy homes. It was a total revolution in heating. Instead of one smoky hearth in the middle of a room, you could now have multiple fireplaces on different floors, each with a flue that carried smoke neatly out of the building. The downside? Chimneys were expensive to build, tricky to maintain, and had an unfortunate habit of catching fire. Still, they were a huge step up from, let's just make a bonfire indoors and hope for the best. Castles like Dover and Kenilworth in England eventually got elaborate chimney systems, with fireplaces big enough to roast an ox, which, coincidentally, was sometimes exactly what they were used for. The warming pan and other medieval inventions. Even with fireplaces, bedrooms could still feel like meat lockers. That's where a few clever little tools came in. One was the warming pan, a small metal pan with a long handle, filled with hot coals and slid between the bed sheets before sleeping. Think of it as a 14th century electric blanket, minus the electricity, and plus a small risk of setting your mattress on fire. Then there were foot warmers, little boxes with embers placed under your feet while you sat, and bed socks, though they didn't call them that, of course. They just wore layers until movement became optional. For the wealthy, fur-lined robes and heavy cloaks were essential indoor fashion. You didn't wear your house wore you, the servant's lot, living by the hearth. While royalty fought drafts in velvet, the servants had more direct tactics. Proximity to fire, They slept in kitchens, hallways, near ovens, anywhere the warmth lingered. Of course, that also meant they slept surrounded by smoke, rats, and sometimes the delightful sound of dripping fat from the roasting spits above. But still, warm is warm. In the morning, before the lords and ladies even stirred, servants had to relight the fires, fetch wood, and air out the chambers, which meant starting every freezing morning outside, carrying logs, and coming back in just to inhale another dose of smoke. It's a miracle any of them lived long enough to become characters in history books. Heating the castle strategically. By the late Middle Ages, castle architects started getting smarter about heat. They began designing keeps with smaller rooms, easier to warm, and adding fireplaces in private chambers. Some even experimented with early underfloor heating systems, inspired by ancient Roman hypocausts. The Romans had perfected this centuries earlier. Hot air from a furnace flowed under raised floors, warming the rooms above. Medieval engineers tried to replicate it, mostly in monasteries or royal bathhouses, but it never quite caught on widely. Too expensive, too complex, too easy to smoke yourself out. Still, the idea shows they were thinking about comfort, slowly, begrudgingly, but surely. A king's winter routine. Let's peek into a royal winter day, just to set the scene. You wake up in your massive canopy bed, half buried in furs. Your breath fogs in the air, the coals in the fireplace are barely glowing, and a servant is quietly tiptoeing in with new logs. You stay in bed until the room is warm enough to move without shattering. Breakfast is usually served in the side chamber, close to the kitchen. Because walking through a freezing hall first thing in the morning was a level of bravery reserved for knights. Throughout the day, fires burned in every occupied room, and the rest of the castle was simply abandoned to the cold. Entire wings could go unused for months, their doors shut tight to keep what little heat there was contained. And at night, the same process in reverse. Fires dammed down, tapestries drawn tight, and everyone wrapped in wool until morning. It's not exactly Versailles-level glamour, but it kept the blood flowing. Barely. Monasteries and monks, cold but composed. Interestingly, one group handled cold better than anyone: monks. Medieval monasteries were models of stoic endurance. Monks followed strict schedules, up before dawn, prayers in unheated chapels, hours spent copying manuscripts in icy scriptoria. Their solution wasn't luxury, it was layers and discipline. Wool robes, fingerless gloves, and sometimes even heated stones placed under their desks to keep their hands from going numb while writing. If you've ever complained about typing in a cold room, just imagine illuminating a Bible with a quill while your ink freezes mid-letter. Castles and candles. The subtle heat. One often overlooked source of warmth. Candles. Not much, but in a world without electricity, every flame counted. A few dozen beeswax candles burning in a closed chamber could actually raise the temperature a degree or two. Not to mention fill the air with a faintly sweet smell, and soot. For the nobility, beeswax candles were a luxury item, bright, clean-burning, and expensive. Servants and common folk may do with tallow candles, cheaper, smellier, and prone to dripping. But either way, when night came early and the cold pressed in, even a few flickering flames made all the difference. Let's drift over to a colder corner of history now. Not all medieval castles were created equal. Southern Europe, Spain, Italy, southern France had far milder winters. so their castles focused more on staying cool in the summer than warm in the winter. But move north, say, to England, Germany, or Scandinavia, and architecture started looking more like armor than housing. Thick walls, narrow windows, smaller chambers, all built to trap what little warmth existed. The irony, of course, is that the grander the castle, the colder it usually was. The rich built monuments to power, and then spend the rest of their lives trying to survive inside them. The smell of medieval warmth. Now, it's worth remembering that warmth came with ambiance. Every fire meant smoke. Every fur meant animal musk. The air was thick with a mix of soot, sweat, wood, and old meat. This wasn't the clean, cozy log cabin scent we imagine today. It was more campfire and compost, with notes of survival. And yet, for people of the time, that was home. Warmth and smoke were comforting because they meant life. If you could smell the fire, you knew you weren't freezing to death. Yet. Royal guests and the politics of warmth. Hosting visitors in winter was a role.
Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of royal history. Someplace where the trumpets have already faded, the armies have marched off, and the crown has just rolled off a severed political career and landed, rather awkwardly, on the floor. Because tonight, we're not talking about kings. We're talking about the people who were left behind when kings fell, their children. The princes who never got to sit on their thrones. The princesses who were suddenly downgraded from "Your Grace" to "Please don't arrest me." The small, confused toddlers who woke up one morning to discover that everyone was whispering now, and no one would explain why the guards suddenly looked different, or angrier. So, if you're ready, maybe dim the lights, settle a little deeper under the blankets, and let's drift through the long, accidental history of royal kids who became political baggage the moment their fathers lost the crown. Because for most royal children, the fall of a king. To talk about after dark. So, let's drift through a few stories, quietly, and meet some of the small humans who had the misfortune of being born into the wrong dynasty at the wrong time. Let's drift first to medieval England, to two boys in a tower. You probably already know the story, though it's usually told with more drama and fewer yawns. But tonight, we're keeping everything soft, slow, and just gently unfortunate. The year is 1483. King Edward IV has died unexpectedly, leaving behind two sons, 12-year-old Edward, the new king, and 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York. These boys were more or less the royal equivalent of those bright hotel lobby vases that everyone pretends to love but secretly hopes will not be their responsibility. Edward IV's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, suddenly decided that he was perhaps inexplicably and mystically destined to rule England himself. This was a very common condition among medieval uncles. Richard placed both boys in the Tower of London, officially for safekeeping, which medieval rulers said the way modern people say, "I might have accidentally deleted something important." The boys were last seen playing in the courtyard. After that, nothing. No escape. No rebellion. No surviving diary entries that say something helpful like, "Please stop putting us in towers." Just silence. The new king, Richard III, insisted everything was fine. Everyone else pretended to believe him. And the princes simply became one of history's quiet unanswered questions. Their fall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly loud. It was just the gentle erasure of two children whose father lost the throne, and took their future with him. Next, let's drift to France. Where royal children suffered from a different problem entirely, they survived, which was inconvenient for everyone. Take the children of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The French Revolution did not believe in half measures. When they removed a king, they made sure the removal was decisive, permanent, and executed with the kind of bureaucratic enthusiasm that only committees can summon. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had 4 children, though 2 died young. Their surviving son, Louis Charles, was 8 when the revolutionaries decided he was dangerous. Which is a strong word to apply to a child whose main political strategy was crying. After the king and queen were executed, Louis Charles became a problem. Because technically, in the eyes of royalists, he was now King Louis XVII. The revolutionaries solved this awkwardness by, well, locking him in a dark room. Alone. For years. A child. In solitary confinement. He was not allowed fresh air, schooling, or human affection, because affection, apparently, was politically suspicious now. He died at age 10. The official cause was illness, but the unofficial cause was everything. His sister, Marie Therese, was luckier. Instead of being locked in a cell, she was traded, like slightly distressed royal furniture, for political prisoners held by Austria. She spent years trying to figure out who she was allowed to be now. Not a princess. Not a peasant. Just a survivor of a monarchy that had collapsed on top of her. Now, let's drift east, to Russia. Where royal children had a talent for being inconvenient. The Romanovs specialized in dramatic endings, though we'll keep things soft and quiet tonight. Long before the fall of Nicholas II, Russian history had already built up a strong resume of royal child mishandling. Take Ivan VI. A baby who accidentally became Emperor of Russia at 2 months old, which is excessive responsibility even by royal standards. He was immediately overthrown by Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, who politely decided she'd rather rule herself. Rather than harming the baby, which would have been rude, even for 18th century politics, she simply locked him away. But not in a sad Victorian orphan story sort of way. More like an eternally misplaced library book sort of way. Ivan spent his entire life, 23 years, moving from prison to prison. He grew up without toys, tutors, or friends. Whenever guards reported that he was kind, or quiet, or showed signs of intelligence, officials became nervous. Intelligent imprisoned princes were not fashionable. Eventually, he was murdered during a failed rescue attempt. A rescue attempt he didn't even know was happening. A child who became a king before he learned to walk, and a prisoner before he learned to speak. All because the wrong relative put on a crown at the wrong moment. Let's drift further back in time, to the world of the Byzantine Empire. A place where royal children grew up surrounded by marble, mosaics, religious chants, and the constant probability that someone was plotting against them during lunch. Take the case of Michael III's young son. Or the sons of Constantine VI. Or the many boys who had the misfortune of being crowned co-emperor at age 4, because Byzantines thought giving toddlers political titles was somehow stabilizing. These children often found themselves deposed, blinded, or quietly retired to monasteries. Monasteries, in medieval politics, were the equivalent of saying, "We're not killing you, but please never leave this building." Little princes spent their days copying manuscripts, contemplating theology, and trying to forget that they once technically ruled a quarter of the known world. Imagine being 7 and exiled to a monastery for political reasons. Imagine not even understanding the politics. Imagine being told, gently, by a monk, "No, dear, you can't be emperor anymore. Brother Gregory is in charge now." It was a soft ending. A quiet one. But no less final. And now, let's drift to the Mongol Empire. Where royal children dealt with an entirely different problem: they had too many fathers. Not biologically. Politically. When a Khan died, succession involved uncles, brothers, cousins, and ambitious steppe aristocrats who all believed, quite sincerely, that they were uniquely qualified to rule the largest land empire on earth. The sons of defeated Khans usually faced three fates. Absorption into another branch of the family, which was basically like being adopted by the people who had just conquered your parents. Political hostage status, which meant living in a tent so luxurious that you sometimes forgot you were, technically, imprisoned. Vanishing into the steppe, which is a poetic way of saying, "We're not sure what happened, but it probably wasn't great." Royal children in the Mongol world were rarely killed outright. They were too valuable. Too symbolic. Too dynasty-shaped. But their lives were often defined by who controlled them. Your father fell. Your uncle now raised you. Another uncle wanted you dead. A third uncle might adopt you. A fourth uncle wanted to marry you into his line, if you happened to be a daughter. A fifth uncle might offer you a pony. It was complicated. But quietly complicated. Let's drift west again, this time to Scotland. Where small royal children developed a survival strategy called, grow up in another country. James I of Scotland, captured as a boy, imprisoned by the English for 18 years. James II, king at age 6, controlled by noble factions for most of his childhood. James III, also became king as a child. James V, king at age 1. Scottish princes had a life cycle something like: born. Crown placed on head before they could speak. Noble regents start arguing. Child becomes a symbol. Someone inevitably sends them abroad, for safety. They return years later, confused but polite. Children of fallen Scottish kings sometimes survived surprisingly well, mostly because everyone was too busy fighting each other to harm them directly. Chaos is dangerous, but it is also, occasionally, protective. And now, let's drift to the softest of all fates, exile. Many children of overthrown kings simply became wanderers. Not peasants. Not nobles. Not quite royalty. Just people carrying a royal surname that made border guards nervous. The children of the deposed Portuguese Braganzas. The Spanish Bourbons after Napoleon. The children of African kings displaced by colonial powers. Indian princely heirs shipped to England for education. Persian princes sent to Paris. Ottoman princes exiled to France, where they discovered cafes, cigarettes, and the strange modern feeling of being irrelevant. Life in exile could be almost normal. Almost. But every passport, every letter, every polite conversation carried the quiet reminder that somewhere out there was a throne that used to be theirs and now belonged to someone else. No armies were chasing them. No towers were waiting. No prisons. Just a long, slow life spent not being what they were born to be. A soft ending. A tired one. But perhaps the kindest of all. So what happened to the children of fallen kings? Well, everything. And nothing. They were hidden. Protected. Imprisoned. Exiled. Married off. Forgotten. Or turned, accidentally, into symbols of rebellions they never asked for. Some grew up to be kings after all. Some became monks. Some became rumors. Some became history's long echo of what might have been. Most were just children, small, frightened, confused, trying to survive the political collapse of the adults around them. They didn't fall with their fathers. But they lived in the rubble. And in the quiet. Always the quiet. Part 2. What happened to the children of fallen kings? Hey everyone. Let's settle back in, maybe adjust your pillow, maybe let your breathing slow a little. Because tonight, we're still wandering through the quieter corners of royal history, the places where lost crowns echo softly, and where the children left behind had to figure out what it meant to grow up in a world that no longer had space for them. In the first part, we drifted through towers, monasteries, exiles, and a few more prisons than anyone really needs before bedtime. But we're not done yet. Because the fall of a king didn't just reshape the lives of his children during childhood. It followed them into adulthood too, shaping who they married, where they lived, what they were allowed to say, and, occasionally, whether they were allowed to say anything ever again. So let's keep drifting. Softly. Quietly. Through the long shadow cast by a fallen crown. Let's move back for a moment to a kingdom that always seemed to fall apart at exactly the wrong time, England. We tend to imagine English princes growing up in warm, well-lit palaces, surrounded by knights and tutors who said things like, "Your Highness, perhaps don't poke the tapestry with that dagger." But for the children of fallen kings, the castle walls weren't comforting. They were warning labels. Take Henry VI, the chronically unlucky king who lost his throne twice and spent the rest of his life proving that mental illness and medieval politics were a disastrous combination. His only son, Prince Edward of Westminster, was raised like a child who was already a political slogan. People whispered that the Queen ruled in his name. People whispered that he wasn't even Henry's biological child. People whispered a lot, medieval people loved whispering, and none of it helped a young boy who just wanted to throw a javelin and be left alone. Prince Edward grew up in exile. France, Scotland, back to France, then back to England. His father's crown came off like a loose button, and every time it fell, Edward's life tilted a little more. By age 17, he wasn't just a prince, he was a symbol of a civil war. And symbols rarely get happy endings. He died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Some say he fell in combat. Some say he was executed afterward. Some say he annoyed the wrong nobleman. The accounts vary, which usually means the truth wasn't flattering. Prince Edward never sat on the throne. He barely sat still. His whole life was spent moving, a wandering heir following a wandering crown. Let's drift a little south, to the sunlit courts of Spain. Spain produced some of the most tragic royal children in Europe, not because they were violently deposed, but because they were delicately undermined. Take the children of Queen Joanna, better known, somewhat rudely, as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Now, Joanna probably wasn't mad. She was more likely depressed, isolated, manipulated, or all three. But medieval men had a very specific way of describing women who didn't do what they wanted. Ah yes, she must be insane. When Joanna's husband died, the charming, unfaithful, politically gifted Philip the Handsome, her mental health collapsed. Naturally, the men of the family saw this as a political opportunity. Her children were quietly taken from her. One by one. Her oldest son, Charles, was raised to rule an empire. Her daughters were sent to convents or political marriages. Joanna herself was locked away in a monastery for nearly 50 years, not because she was dangerous, but because her existence was politically inconvenient. And her children? Well, they grew up with power, yes. But also with the knowledge that their rise had required their mother's disappearance. Fallen kings were one thing. A fallen queen was another. And her children lived in the shadow of a decision that none of them had been old enough to understand. Now let's float east again, to the glittering but brittle world of
chimneys, the medieval game changer. Now, at some point, humanity decided that maybe, just maybe, all the smoke in the living room was a problem. That's when the chimney entered the chat. Chimneys began appearing in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, first in monasteries and wealthy homes. It was a total revolution in heating. Instead of one smoky hearth in the middle of a room, you could now have multiple fireplaces on different floors, each with a flue that carried smoke neatly out of the building. The downside? Chimneys were expensive to build, tricky to maintain, and had an unfortunate habit of catching fire. Still, they were a huge step up from, let's just make a bonfire indoors and hope for the best. Castles like Dover and Kenilworth in England eventually got elaborate chimney systems with fireplaces big enough to roast an ox, which, coincidentally, was sometimes exactly what they were used for. The warming pan and other medieval inventions. Even with fireplaces, bedrooms could still feel like meat lockers. That's where a few clever little tools came in. One was the warming pan, a small metal pan with a long handle filled with hot coals and slid between the bed sheets before sleeping. Think of it as a 14th century electric blanket, minus the electricity, and plus a small risk of setting your mattress on fire. Then there were foot warmers, little boxes with embers placed under your feet while you sat, and bed socks, though they didn't call them that, of course. They just wore layers until movement became optional. For the wealthy, fur-lined robes and heavy cloaks were essential indoor fashion. You didn't wear your house wore you.
Some warriors. Some traders. Some simply lived quiet lives in the same towns their fathers once ruled. A fallen king's child here didn't always lose status. Sometimes, they gained a new one untouched by the responsibilities or expectations of ruling. It was one of the few places where a royal child might look at their father's downfall and think, well, this might actually be an improvement. Now let's drift into the world of the Holy Roman Empire, a place so politically chaotic that even historians sometimes need a nap afterward. Here, kings fell often, mostly because there were too many people who thought they were kings. When an emperor was deposed, his children were rarely imprisoned. They were reclassified. A royal son might become a duke, a margrave, a prince-bishop, or, in particularly bureaucratic cases, a count of something recently invented. Royal daughters were married off to neighboring states as quickly as humanly possible, usually to secure the family's next political gamble. The children of fallen emperors didn't disappear. They just slid sideways into different political boxes. Sometimes they rose again. Sometimes they didn't. But they rarely died for their father's crown. They just adjusted their titles. Medieval Europe loved titles. It had more titles than common sense. Next, let's wander up to Scandinavia, where monarchies rose and fell the way snowdrifts shift in the wind, quietly, slowly, and with minimal paperwork. Children of fallen kings in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were often fostered by noble families, raised in comfortable obscurity until someone decided whether they were a problem or not. Many lived perfectly normal lives. Or as normal as one can live when one's name still opens castle doors. Some became knights. Some clerics. Some even became merchants, which medieval nobles considered slightly embarrassing but not fatal. But occasionally, one child would return. Like a quiet ghost. Like a rumor with better posture. But occasionally, one child would return. Like a quiet ghost. Like a rumor with better posture. Claiming a throne. Reviving an old claim. Starting a gentle, well-mannered civil war. Scandinavian civil wars were famously polite. Many ended with treaties that basically said, let's just share the crown and take turns. This created some very confused children of very confused fallen kings. But confusion, at least, was not fatal. Now let's drift back into France, because France always has one more tragic royal child waiting in the wings. This time, it's the children of Napoleon. Now, Napoleon did not technically fall. He more slid down the political staircase, loudly, twice. His son, Napoleon II, was taken to Austria and raised by a grandfather who preferred him safely hidden behind curtains. He grew up in luxury, but never learned French properly. Never saw a battlefield. Never ruled anything larger than his own schedule. He died at 21, consumed by tuberculosis, and by the weight of a name too large for one boy to carry. His father had ruled Europe. He ruled his bedroom. This was one of the softest, saddest forms of political erasure, the kind that replaces power not with prisons, but with polite suffocation. And finally, let's drift to the quietest fate of all, the children who simply chose to disappear. Some royal children, after losing everything, walked away. They changed their names. They became scholars, merchants, priests, poets, people who bought bread without anyone bowing. Some lived longer than any of the kings who replaced their fathers. Some lived happier. Some lived anonymously. Some lived freely for the first time. A fallen king's child did not always fall. Sometimes they landed somewhere softer. Somewhere human. So what happened to the children of fallen kings? Everything. And also, nothing unusual. They were protected, imprisoned, adopted, tucked away, lost, found, married off, forgotten, or quietly transformed into someone entirely different. Most didn't want power. Most didn't understand it. Most were simply born at the wrong moment in the wrong palace. They survived their fathers' downfalls, not with swords, not with diplomacy, but with smallness. With silence. With patience. Because children do not fall with kings. They only live in the shadows left behind. And those shadows stretch very, very far. Hey everyone. Let's settle back in, loosen the shoulders, maybe take that slow breath you meant to take 10 minutes ago. Because tonight, we're wandering into the softer, dustier corners of royal history again, the places where the portraits stop, the records fade, and the children of fallen kings continue to quietly exist, long after the crown has slipped off someone's head and hit the floor with a very undramatic thud. No need to hurry. We'll just drift. From one hidden room to another. From one displaced child to the next. And, as usual, we'll keep the tone gentle, even if the royals involved made decisions that were anything but. Let's drift to France, and into a tower with two very unfortunate boys. The story of fallen kings in France has a particular flavor to it. A flavor best described as a mix of wine, paranoia, and a complete inability to handle political transitions without locking someone up. So, let's settle into the quiet tragedy of the princes in the tower's French equivalent, the story of Charles Orleans' son, a small, quiet boy named Louis of Orleans, who had the misfortune of being born into a dynasty that loved power but hated stability. Louis's father, Charles, had been one of France's most important dukes, until he was assassinated in a narrow Parisian street by the men of the rival Burgundy faction. It was a classic medieval move. Very political. Very personal. Very messy. Louis was just a toddler at the time. Which meant he inherited exactly three things. A title. A set of enemies. And anxieties he was too young to understand but almost certainly felt anyway. When his father fell, Louis became a political problem, which, in royal life, is never good for childhood development. He didn't get a comforting nursery or a wise tutor. He got confinement. A quiet one. But still confinement. His closest relatives protected him in big stone houses with thick walls and very few windows, a medieval way of saying, please don't kill this child. We're trying to keep him alive long enough for him to learn how to sign documents. Louis grew up under constant guard. He wasn't allowed to mingle with other noble children, because mingling tends to lead to alliances, and alliances tend to lead to rebellions, and France had enough rebellions to last several lifetimes. He spent years reading, pacing, and being politely bored. A lifestyle he perfected to the point that, once free, he became one of medieval Europe's most introverted poets. Which makes sense. If your childhood is essentially a politely lit prison, poetry becomes a natural escape. But Lewis was one of the lucky ones. He survived childhood. He grew up. He eventually left his fortress of safety and walked into adulthood like a hesitant deer stepping out of the woods, deeply suspicious of sunlight. And then, he rebuilt his family. Quietly. But fully. A rare, soft ending. Now let's float over to Russia. Where fallen kings created children no one wanted to claim. Russia, in the days of dynasties and tsars, had a very specific approach to handling the children of disgraced rulers, pretend they didn't exist, but also keep them under watch, just in case they ruined everything by existing too loudly. One such child was Ivan VI, a forgotten czar who became a baby emperor, then an imprisoned toddler, then a political inconvenience, and then a tragic footnote. But tonight isn't about Ivan. It's about his siblings. The ones history usually forgets, because they were neither crowned nor killed, they just lived in that strange middle space of too dangerous to free, too harmless to execute. When Ivan VI's regency collapsed and Empress Elizabeth seized the throne, because Russians never did anything calmly, she ordered the entire family arrested. The children, all under 10, were packed into wagons and taken deep into the countryside. Not dramatically. Not violently. Just quietly. The way unwanted letters are slipped into a drawer. They lived in a series of small houses, accompanied by guards who were instructed to make their lives dull, controlled, and uneventful, an order they followed with exceptional enthusiasm. For years, the siblings weren't allowed visitors, weren't taught politics, weren't allowed books without approval, weren't permitted to write letters. The goal was simple: let them grow up, but let them grow up away from everything. They became adults with no political ambitions because they had no political vocabulary. They couldn't rebel, they barely understood what rebellion meant. They didn't even know how their brother had once been czar. That detail had been removed from their lives the way a teacher erases the last line on a chalkboard. Eventually, they were quietly released. Not into power. Just into obscurity. A gift, in its own understated way. Their story is soft, but heavy, like a blanket that's been sitting in a cupboard too long. Let's drift west, to Scotland, where a queen's children grew up without her. Now we float to Scotland. A land of fog, stone, and monarchs with more dramatic arcs than a modern TV show, but we'll keep it slow. This is the gentle tragedy of Mary, Queen of Scots' children. Mary's fall was famously turbulent. But the fate of her only surviving child, James, is less dramatic and more, quietly ironic. When Mary was imprisoned and forced to abdicate, baby James became king. Not that he noticed. He was 1 year old and mainly concerned with basic survival and whatever medieval toys were available, which, given Scotland's budget at the time, were probably carved sticks. The Scottish lords, not trusting Mary or each other, whisked James away to Stirling Castle. They raised him with strict tutors, cold rooms, and the Scottish fear of disorder, which he absorbed like a sponge. James grew into a nervous, bookish young man. He adored learning. He also adored not being murdered, which became his lifelong hobby. His mother remained imprisoned, first in Scotland, then in England. James grew up seeing her name mostly in letters, reports, and occasionally whispered warnings. The emotional distance became physical distance. And the physical became permanent. James became King of England. Mary died without ever seeing him again. It's the kind of tragic relationship that could fuel an entire season of a prestige drama. But we'll keep it soft here. Just a mother and child who lived parallel lives, drifting further apart with every passing year. A gentle wandering into the lives of the forgotten sons of the Islamic empires. Most Islamic empires had well-organized systems. But none were particularly kind to the spare sons of fallen rulers. Take the Abbasid princes after the Mongol sack of Baghdad. When the city fell in 1258, many members of the royal family vanished, some killed, some escaped, and some quietly reappeared years later in the courts of other Muslim rulers, looking very much like people who had just watched their entire world collapse. One such child was Abu el-Qasim Ahmad, a young prince who managed to survive by being so small and so politically irrelevant that the Mongols didn't bother with him. He was quietly smuggled out, hidden in caravans, protected by distant relatives who hoped, without much confidence, that the dynasty might someday revive. He grew up in Cairo, in a world that was not his, surrounded by reminders of a caliphate that no longer existed. His caretakers told him stories about Baghdad the way people tell children about mythical lands, softly, carefully, with more nostalgia than accuracy. He eventually lived his life as a symbolic figurehead, used by the Mamluks to claim legitimacy. Not a ruler. Not truly a prisoner. Just a polite ornament of empire. A strange existence. Quiet. Dignified. Slightly sad. And finally, a soft glide toward China, where fallen dynasties lingered for centuries. China had one of the most interesting approaches to the children of fallen kings: they let them live. Usually. But under watch. Lots of watch. When the Ming dynasty collapsed and the Qin took over, thousands of princes, princesses, cousins, and faintly related relatives suddenly became remnants of a dynasty that no longer existed. And the Qin, practical as always, had a simple policy. Don't kill them. But don't let them wander either. Many were given small stipends. Small houses. Small expectations. One such child, Zhu Yosong's young nephew, became the quiet center of a small community of surviving Ming loyalists. They treated him with the reverence normally given to a ruler, even though he had no authority and no real future as a monarch. He grew up in a tiny, quiet world: tea houses, old stories, loyal retainers too old to fight, and a city that barely remembered the dynasty he represented. He became a living memory. Not a king. Not a prisoner. Just a reminder of something that used to be. And when he died, the loyalists mourned him as if the last ember of an entire era had finally gone out. A very small flame. But a warm one.